A warm welcome to those of you here at the Yale Center for British Art and to those of you who are joining us online. I'm Scott Wilcox. Until I retired last year, I was the Deputy Director of Collections here at the Center. Now, I want to start with Yale's acknowledgement that Indigenous people and nations, including Mohegan, Mashantucket Pequot, Eastern Pequot, Scotticoke, Golden Hill Pagusset, Niantic, and the Quinnipiac and other Algonquin-speaking people have stewarded through generations the lands and waterways of what is now the state of Connecticut. We honor and respect the enduring relationship that exists between these peoples and nations and this land. Okay, sitting with me is Maria Antonella Pelizzari, who co-edited the book with me that we are gathered here to talk about this afternoon, and that is The Idea of Italy, Photography and the British Imagination, 1840 to 1900. Antonella is a professor of art history at Hunter College and the Graduate Center, City University of New York. Her expertise covers a wide range of subjects and time periods, including Italian photography and culture from its beginnings to the present, 19th century British colonialism, American modernism, and the interdisciplinary dialogue between photography and architecture. We are delighted to have with us Maria Morris Hambourg, independent curator, author, and consultant, and the founding curator of the Department of Photographs at the Metropolitan Museum of Art. She began her career at the Museum of Modern Art, co-authoring the 4-volume study, The Work of Aceh, before coming to the Met in 1985, where over a period of about 2 decades, she was instrumental in building the museum's photography collections. And Stephen Pinson, who is a curator in the Department of Photographs at the Metropolitan Museum of Art. He has written widely on the histories of both printmaking and photography, with a special interest in the beginnings of photography in France. Before joining the Met in 2015, he headed the Miriam and Ira D. Wallach Division of Art, Prints, and Photographs at the New York Public Library, and held fellowships at the Center for Advanced Study in the Visual Arts, Columbia University, and the Met. So I want to thank you all for being here, and I want to thank you all for being here. Such a good attendance. The 4 of us will talk for about 50 minutes, after which we will take questions from the audience. For those of you who are here in the hall, please wait for the microphone to come to you before speaking. And for those of you tuning in remotely, please send your questions to ycba.programs@yale.edu. Now, for those of you who are here in person, a reception will follow in the entrance court, where Antonella and I will be happy to sign copies. And the study room, located on the 2nd floor, will remain open until 5:30. If you haven't already done so, we encourage you to visit after the program to see a display of works related to the publication. Okay, I can date the start of the Idea of Italy project to a particular conversation with Antonella back in 2012. And it was not long after that Antonella took me to meet Bruce and Dee Lundberg with their extraordinary collection of 19th century photographs of Italy. Although it was clear that this was a topic with immense potential, it took a few years before the project got going in earnest. But in November 2018, we held a workshop here at the center, which enabled us to give it form. The project was intended as an exhibition, which, with a keen sense of regret, was set aside in the early days of the pandemic. But fortunately, we were able to persevere with the book. And before we begin our conversation about the book, I want to offer thanks to the Dr. Lee McCormick Edwards Charitable Foundation, which generously supported both the workshop and the publication. I also want to mention the managing editor, Deborah Canarella, and the designer, Julie Fry, who did so much to make it the handsome publication that it is. And finally, the former director, Amy Myers, who enthusiastically supported the project from its inception, and the current Paul Mellon director, Courtney Martin, who continued to support the project and made the book possible. Okay. The idea of Italy, the project, is in some sense a logical successor to Traces of India, Photography, Architecture, and the Politics of Representation, 1850 to 1900, an exhibition at the Canadian Center for Architecture and the YCBA back in 2003. That was the first time that Antonella and I worked together. Antonella, maybe you could say a little bit about how the idea of Italy grew out of concerns that underlay the Traces of India and how the two projects differ.
Yes, I can. Thank you, Scott, for all the words, and I'm also thankful to all of you for coming and listening to the process of this book. And we're very lucky to have scholars and curators like Stephen and Maria who are helping to understand what we actually did. 2003 is a long time ago, and indeed that is when Traces of India came out. Here are the two covers of the book. Traces of India was generated at the Canadian Center for Architecture. I have to say I'm grateful to Phyllis Lambert for asking me to start and conclude this project. And well, the question of these projects is similar. It's about cultural encounter, and it's about how photography is a vehicle of that encounter. But you can tell from the covers are always very difficult, like titles. You can tell from the covers that these are very different projects. Traces of India is a detail of a 21 Albumen print, long inscription that documents by Linneo Stripe, that documents an inscription around the temple of Tanjavur in Tamil Nadu, in the southeast of India. And it speaks of the survey, a photographer who was working for the East India Company. Idea of Italy cover is evocative, it's suggestive, is a photograph never been seen and published by Robert McPherson. And what we're looking at is this evocative steep flight of stairs that leads up to a balcony of the evil and attracting Lucrezia Borgia. It's a place of murder stories as well as mythology that is embedded with the British imagination about Rome. Mythology is connected to British writers like Byron and so on and so forth. So we're talking about a cultural encounter, but on one side, it's really more about science, what photography does. On the other hand, it's really about what photography can help the British to imagine. Let's look at a few more images. There are similarities. It's quite striking to see how William Hodges in the 1700s in India, this British artist, is doing something, is feeling something about the ruins. That's not that different from what Piranesi was doing in Rome. There is the romance of ruins. There is also this sense of decline and fall that the British want to live up to. And so there's a tension with that, okay? What's the empire, the Mughal, the Roman that has fallen? Where are we in this scheme, in this framework? And let's look at the other ones. Both projects, and you could see this even better if there was the exhibition here, but certainly want to trace the genesis of certain representation to the pre-photographic and see how that continues, whether Samuel Bourne, Robert Macpherson, or others, in the mapping of a country through its monument, and how photographs of architecture can be traced back to previous representation. And then, so some similarities. But then when I was looking at collections of traces of India, I was constantly confronting the photograph that is the object of a survey and the fragments that are very interesting, and I really want to point this out, go to write a publication about the history of Indian architecture, all right? And so the British are writing the history through these photographs. And so let's look at the next and last slide. Very different. Yes, we have some more detailed images of the ruins of Rome, and there's this gorgeous close-up view that you can see upstairs by James Anderson of the base of the column representing the fights of the Roman Empire. But there's a sense of awe, there's a sense of admiration, there is a sense of confrontation with images of a past empire that are very different from India. So, but certainly the projects provoked very similar questions. And I conclude here.
Maria, your exhibition, The Waking Dream, Photography's First Century, at the Metropolitan Museum back in 1993 was a true landmark. Included in that exhibition were two photographs by Robert Macpherson, the two which I show on the screen, and one by Giacomo Caneva, both photographers who have important roles in the idea of Italy. How has the understanding and appreciation of early photography evolved since The Waking Dream? And how do you see the idea of Italy as fitting within that evolution?
Well, back in '93, we were just emerging from the Dark Ages. There was just a smattering of people who were interested in early photographs, 19th century photographs. And, but then in the 70s and 80s, something happened which generated a great interest, which at first was on the part of collectors and dealers and auctioneers, because the first auction, modern auction, was in 1971, and in it were the first tricklings of what became an outpouring of treasures of 19th century photography from the attics and the basements and the libraries of the great family houses. And then they would come to auction, and then the information in them, as well as the images themselves, would be gathered up bit by bit, little scraps of information. And gradually, this sort of tribe of interested people began to put together a real history. And by 1993, we had a pretty good broad sketch of, a scaffolding of the history. But at the time, as you could see photographs like these, they're superb images, but most of and this is, once again, Macpherson, a Scotsman, who took these images, and he was clearly, by this time we understood that people like Fox Talbot and Macpherson and many, many others were masters of the medium. But we knew them through, 2, 3 examples shown in exhibitions that were surveys of collections. So the information, while it was being gathered, was still rather partial and spotty. But now, 30 years later, I mean, it's a totally different world. We, you know, a book like The Idea of Italy could not possibly have been published in 1993. I mean, at the time, back when, and as I say, in the Dark Ages, there were very few courses in the history of photography taught anywhere. Whereas today, every college art department has a history of photography, and now several generations of scholars with PhDs have emerged and are teaching at graduate levels all over, you know. And so a book like this with 16 distinct authors, you know, dealing with 16 different subjects within this little 60-year period in one country, in Britain, drilling down in these sort of myriad veins of information. That kind of you know, detail and complexity and sort of multivariant foci was not at all possible, you know, 30 years ago.
Right.
So, and you know, I think we now have, as you know, as we can go on and talk about, also the possibility for very deeply researched, absolutely stunning, splendid exhibits of a single artist, such as the one that was given to Giraud de Prangé about 3 years ago at the Met, and then previously unknown. I mean, virtually unknown to the general public, and maybe known to us by one image. You know, so it's an extraordinary difference now.
Yeah.
Steven.
Well, we had your example to go on, Maria. So.
Yeah. It's just a beginning.
Steven, I have a broad question and narrow it down to this beautiful project we were able to see in 2019 at the Metropolitan Museum. You worked largely in early French photography, and we want to talk more about this project, which was titled Monumental Journey, the daguerreotype of Giraud de Prangé. The broader question here, I'm curious to engage with you, is how do you see your monographic project on Giraud, and we could add other ones, in relationship to the idea of Italy, where we single out the vision of British photographers working for a British center, a vision of British photographers looking at a specific country. What can you tell us?
Well, I'm glad you asked that question because it's, as you know, it's something that I've been thinking about ever since I was asked to participate in this discussion and I read the book. And it reminded me somewhat of the first time I was working at the Met, which was as a fellow in 2002, 2003. And there was an exhibition that I contributed to on the French daguerreotype. And one of the criticisms, you know, you never forget criticisms of things, but one of the criticisms, which was a valid criticism at the time, was that the exhibition itself really didn't address what was French about French daguerreotypes. And as you know, all of us know, having worked on exhibitions before, that there are parameters drawn around exhibitions according to the institutions that are participating. And in this case, it originated from the Musée d'Orsay. So the exhibition was about the daguerreotype in the country that it originated in. So French daguerreotypes. But it did make me wonder about how much of the history of the medium that we study has been circumscribed by geography. Certainly that's how the field sort of came up, and then that's how it started. You know, we looked at photographs made in a certain country, you know, by practitioners from that country, French photography, British photography, Italian photography, on and on and on. And then we sort of progressed to the point where we were looking at photographs made by practitioners of different nationalities in a certain country or in a certain region. And in my own work, you know, I have done somewhat of the same thing. And so it made me wonder how much have we pushed the needle, in terms of where we are. And so I wondered about, how can we really look at photographs and talk about the idea of a country, which is a very nebulous concept, right? And the imagination is also a very nebulous concept. So it made me wonder where you stood on this question of how do you, and if reading through the book, you very clearly see how the various authors were coming to terms with this question. So I wondered if Antonella, you had any further thoughts about that question.
Yes, I mean, I think part of the answer provoked by your question is something we can continue to see through many of our images here, and I think will become clearer, I think, towards the end, because indeed there are some photographers who instill an imagination that is drawn from literature, from British authors, into the photographic.
Right.
The question is otherwise difficult, especially when it comes to photography of architecture. I mean, the cover of the book is about a British imagination, not only because a Scot made that photograph, but because the British traveler to that site who was buying that photograph was connecting to that site through British writers and melodramas that are very cultural, right? Yeah. But it is this difficulty of ascribing photography of place to an idea.
Right.
But then, so let's go back
Sure.
to this. But as we talk about the British, the photographers beside the writers, and so we've all seen this one of the amazing images by Jérôme Lepranger, this daguerreotype with this detail of a monument that was highly photographed, and yet he did something extraordinary in really slicing these detail. Let's look at the next three images, because Stephen, this is going back to what you're asking, right? How do you situate the work of Lepranger, your monographic show, to other contemporary daguerreotypists like Ellis and Ruskin? You can tell us more.
Well, the way I tend to approach especially the larger projects that I've worked on, is by concentrating on the individual practitioners and going from that sort of microscopic level out to a more, a larger view of the cultural context, the social, the political context in which they were working. And so it goes back to your notion in the beginning of a confrontation, of a photographer with another place. And it's interesting to think about Ellis and Lepranger and Ruskin. I think I mentioned one of the first times we talked that originally I had hoped to do an exhibition that featured both Ruskin and Lepranger, and logistically it just turned out not to be possible at the time. But even in these two images that you see here on the screen, you can see that there were very close affinities between the work of Ruskin and the work of Giraud Lepranger. They were both interested in Gothic and Byzantine architecture. They were both working towards writing histories, a history of Venice for Ruskin, a history of Islamic architecture for Giraud Lepranger. Similarly to Ellis, they all used the daguerreotype in different ways as the basis for their illustrated books. And well, in Ellis's case, the book never came to fruition, but that was his idea. And Ruskin and Giraud Lepranger both used the daguerreotypes for their illustrations, but publicly had a hard time confessing that that's what they were actually doing. And only in a couple of cases did they actually say that, yes, in this case, I used a daguerreotype for the illustration. I think because they were both very precocious in their use of photography. And so I think there are these ways that you can compare the work of all three, and especially Giraud de Plongée and Ruskin, even though in the one case you're talking about a British practitioner, and in another case you're talking about a French practitioner, working, within a decade of each other.
From the heyday of the Grand Tour in the 18th century through the advent of photography in the 1830s, a kind of corpus of specific views defined the image of the eternal city. Of course, photographers would inherit these standard views. What does photography bring to the game that's new?
Well, in my opinion, it brings several things, one of the most important of which is specificity of details. So in this case, a little bit close up, you see now the sort of generic brushstrokes of the scene painter, of the view painter. And if you compare that to the photograph, if you look carefully, you'll see that there's a half-harvested field of plantings that are almost certainly for the table. It's wintertime, and you can see that there are a row of citrus trees sort of sheltering in the warmth of the protected garden wall, basking sort of in the reflected heat of that wall. That sort of information is, there are ephemeralities, the weather, the conditions, the stuff, that's in the picture. That is really beneath the attention of the view painter. He's interested in the Colosseum. But this stuff is the fabric that actually binds the monument and the observer in the same real world. And so it's part of what we all love about photographs. Could we have the next slide?
Yeah.
And here is another view. This is Macpherson again, who was really one of the great stars of this period. And does anybody know if this is a view of the Palatine Hill or from the Palatine Hill? It has a title, but it's not very clear when you try to actually locate it on a map. There's a marvelous map over at the museum across the street right now from the end of the 18th century. And I was there today trying to figure out exactly which one it was. But anyway, with photographs, often you find a view that is not what a painter would focus on. It's the adjacent view or the peripheral one. And that's because the photographer is, he's not in the studio. He's standing in the same space he has to, with his surroundings. And so just a pivot will show you a variant of the backside or the other side of the nominal thing, the monument. And some of these can be really very interesting in other ways, because whatever is in the frame is the subject. That's it. And it may be, confusingly imbricated, like kind of muddled like this one is. But here we see nothing so distinctly as sort of the texture of time, which is laid over the not yet exhumed ruins of perhaps the Forum or something like that. So there are other things that photographs do. I think this is a marvelous picture with all that texture and vineyards and very surprising kind of view for the center of Rome. The next view, please. Photographs also compress space and they distort tonal relations. And so in these ways, they emphasize shape and relation and proximity. And they can rhyme near and far or actual and mythological, as you see here, or the living and the dead, in these very poetic ways. The compressions and the distortions are determined by, the lens, the quality of the lens, the nature of these early processes, and the choice of point of view. And they demonstrate pretty obviously that light is the essential operational factor. And you can't really see it too well in this reproduction, which is a poor one, of Kit Talbot's photograph of his daughter in Naples. But this sort of image with which was really, sort of blown out with this effulgent light, which is probably the glorious result of a miscalculation of exposure. That kind of view is extremely rare in British photography of Italy. Most of the images that revel in the Mediterranean light were taken by either the French or the Italians, like the next one of Carlotta Cartudino. This is another one of those pictures that was in The Waking Dream. Marvelous thing, but extremely rare. That sort of, sense of the almost, the feeling of the warmth and the texture of the light. This brings up another subject, though.
Well,
yeah.
I mean, we've been looking to a great extent at photographs by Robert McPherson, James Anderson, and that is true of the book. They each play a major part in our story, and they would seem to embody the notion of Italy without Italians, which is a concept that comes up several times in the book. But the longstanding focus on the monuments of the classical world didn't entirely preclude a fascination with certain aspects of the Italian people, and that's clear in this great photograph by Caneva. And it is, I think, representative of an interest in the picturesqueness and the otherness of the Italians for a northern, let's say, if not specifically British, audience, both purveyed by Italian artists and photographers and responded to by British artists and audiences. And so went too quickly there. So I show some examples from the 18th century and the early pre-photographic 19th century. One is by an English artist. It's a life-size portrait of a Neapolitan woman, which you can actually see up on the 4th floor of this museum, as well as a smaller figure study done by an Italian artist, Labruzzi, but done for largely for a British audience, and then a colored lithograph from a set of views of Italian types and Italian costumes. Again, a work by an Italian, but done in connection with a British lithographer and done largely for a British audience. And here we have another photograph by Caneva, together with two photographs by a French woman photographer. And just to move on, and then three more British works, costume studies, one by a giant of Victorian photography, Julia Margaret Cameron, and then one by a totally unknown photographer, H. Yatman, but both in a way reflecting this kind of interest in the exotic folk costume of the Italians, and then a tour de force watercolor by John Frederick Lewis, best known as an Orientalist. Now, how do we situate these images against the architectural and scenic subjects of much of the photography of Italy? And what does it tell us about the idea of Italy in that problematic formulation?
Well, if we could go back to the previous slide.
Sure.
I feel like I've been cast into the role of the devil's advocate here in this discussion, but these two works by Amélie Guillot-Saguez, who was a French woman photographer who collaborated with her husband, Jacques-Michel Guillot, in the early 1840s in Rome around the Villa Medici. She was really an integral part of the Roman school in the 19th century in introducing the calotype to those photographers working in Italy in the early 1840s. And I do think it's interesting to look at these two photographs that were in an album from 1847 that came to auction about 6 years ago, I believe. And they are very obviously similar to the type of genre scene that Caneva was producing at the time. And I got a little ahead of myself earlier, Antonella, when I was asking you about your thoughts about the idea of Italy. But one of the things that you bring up in your essay is this concept of meridianism, which for me, this was my introduction to that concept, which is a way of borrowing the ways in which we have understood Orientalism over the past 2 or 3 decades, but shifting the axis from east-west to north-south so that you can have this, you can see a relationship between France and Italy or Britain and Italy, which is in some ways reminiscent of the othering that happens in Orientalism, but it's not on an east-west axis, and it's not necessarily a colonial relationship. Mm-hmm. And for me, that was really an illuminating moment for me to understand how you can understand the concept of this project.
Nothing like hearing that I illuminated you. So yes, that gives me incredible pleasure to know that I illuminated you. So we talk about meridianism.
Yeah.
Is that what we want to do? Yes, I mean, you put it very well. There is, in many of these photographs, Caneva, Guillot-Saguez, yes, Italian, French. We know that Caneva was very connected to the so-called Roman school of photography. Well, it was sort of part of it and connected to the French Academy, where Guillot-Saguez would have definitely been. And let's go for a second to Cameron, the Neapolitan, right? That's the Neapolitan by Julia Margaret Cameron. I think this is a really interesting trio of images because I mean, you go upstairs and you see John Frederick Lewis and you understand why you know this better than me, is considered an Orientalist painter because he went to the Orient and he represented every aspect of the carpet, of the decor that was exotic, that was fashionable at that time in Great Britain. Then what? He's in a church which could be Santa Maria in Cosmedin, I would like to check this, in Rome. And this is what he paints. So what do we do with it? We can't say Orientalist painter, even though he has all the stigma and all the qualities for that. And Cameron is photographing May Prinsep here, and she calls her the Neapolitan. And it's very interesting in this story that some of these portraits were actually printed also as carte de visite size, which the carte de visite is this very small picture that was sold to tourists at this time, and it was really about the types, the characters. So yes, I believe that this concept of meridionism, since we cannot say orientalizing Italy is too easy and is nonsense, is a concept that I found when you are able to go to the library and you find the book that you needed. I believe German man Manfred Finster, who created an anthology about British travelers in Italy. So the concept is drawn from the literary, just like Orientalism by Edward Said is drawn from the literary, from the written text, but can certainly be applied to our visuals, to our photographs. And as you put very well, implies an exoticism, perhaps an hegemony, a domination, but not necessarily a colonization, because we know very well that this didn't happen with the British in Italy. And yet, as Scott is saying, where are the people? Italy without Italians, the people are there. But when we start looking at these photographs, and perhaps you can see the next one, when we start looking at these photographs, we realize that there is a view at the so-called other. There is a distance that is much less visible with these sublime prints and photographs of architecture, of monuments, still stopped in time, embalmed in time. What you're looking at here are not British photographs. They are all by photographers who have studios in Naples as well as Rome. They are circulated widely. We found many of these photographs in albums with photographs collected by British travelers. And so that's where the idea of meridionism seems to work. And that's where maybe, yes, indeed you have the Guyosage, but that's also where maybe one can think of a cultural specificity, certainly looking at Italy at this time. And British in Italy, well, you're looking at an incredibly industrial, a very industrialized country, modern, and a country that is still not a country until 1860, and is certainly pre-modern. And there is an attraction. I could read that with great pleasure in the diary of Henry Cole that I could find thanks to various archivists and librarians in London at the Royal College of Art. There's this diary written by Henry Cole of his trip to Rome. And you sense the attraction to that pre-modern, to that pre-archaic, that resonates with these photographs.
Yeah, I think part of the benefit of it as a concept is that it has great flexibility, so you can apply it from country to country, but as is the case with these pictures, within Italy itself, in the othering of southern Italy by the northern Italians. So I think it's a very useful thing to keep hold of, moving forward in other studies as well.
I think what you tend not to see in pictures of Italians, either created by Italians themselves or by French or German photographers or British, are pictures of the kind of industrial laboring class or the sort of top-hatted bourgeoisie. Well, we see one here, but probably because of the umbrella he's holding, he's either English or he's an Italian meant to stand in for an Englishman who's having his pocket picked by a Neapolitan street urchin. And this question of poverty, I think, is an interesting one. If we look at images like these there is a kind of celebration, but there's also a degree of condescension, and then you get to something like this, where you don't have the ethnographic or the picturesque folk costume. You just have images of people who are poor, but who are different, or at least different from the people who would be buying these photographs. And that's part of Meridianism, but it's the sort of darker side of that, I guess.
Yeah, I mean, I think again, going back to Pfister, who did not become famous like Edward Said with his Meridianism, but there's a quote in the book from his anthology, and sort of connecting to what, Scott, you just said, he draws a very interesting conclusion, and when he says the relationship that he studies in literature, but anyway, when he says that the relationship of the British with Italy, this cultural encounter, is bifold, right? There's a double edge. One is about wanting to go to the center of civilization, right? The center. We understand that. And the other one is about the periphery, because the modern country is traveling south, and not only south, it's traveling to a place where indeed these are staged vignettes, but indeed poverty is there, and the farmers are there, and the factories are not there, they're in the making. Scientists are there, but it's as Bess Sonder, it's a very beautiful essay about this in the book, about how Italian photographers are modern as well, and they're finding their instruments to explain where the country is going. But there is a peripheral view. The British going there look down upon these, and I think, the discussion of poverty is part of this.
I think there's a great also parallel to be drawn between what you were just talking about, this bifurcation between the center and the periphery, and photography itself as a medium. When you think about it, it's a modern technology. It's looking forward, but it's also the most retrospective medium, because you're always capturing something that you can look back on. So it itself has this built into the technology.
Now, part of this Italian otherness that the British found to be enticing yet threatening was a perceived sensuality of the people of the South. And again, this is in many ways similar to Orientalism. I think this sensuality and this combination of enticement and threat lies behind Cameron's profoundly beautiful but also disturbing photograph of an Italian model, and Van Gloden's less complex but highly sensual image of a young Southern Italian. Now, each is given a kind of high cultural frame. In the case of Cameron, it's Shakespeare. This is Iago. In the case of Van Gloden, it's the classical antiquity. Any thoughts about?
Let's go to the next one. Just also for the sake of time, if there's any question. But yes, to continue what you said, Scott, and to continue our conversation about Meridianism, what did you say? The fear as well as the attraction, right? That we see in Cameron. By the way, for those of you who don't know, and many here know everything about these photographs, but it's quite astounding that Julia Margaret Cameron's photograph titled Iago, a portrait of an Italian, right? Because this man actually happens to be Italian, but he lives in London, in England. Anyway, it's a unique print. There's only one print in the world, and it's in Bradford, England. Yes, well, it's a particular photograph because she's photographing a model who has modeled for many British artists, among them Edward Burne-Jones as well as George Watts. Usually Cameron does not hire a model. She photographs members of the family and so on and so forth. This is already pretty exceptional. The title, is like, what the hell? What's going on? Is the idea, was she looking for a model who looked like Iago? Or did she give this title once she took this astounding, extraordinary, sensual portrait that is the fear of seduction, right? I mean, we can read so much in this as you were comparing it to von Gloden. Now it's compared for a moment to another of those beautiful Camerons, which is the portrait of Beatrice Cenci after a painting that was considered of Beatrice Cenci by
Guido Reni.
Guido Reni, thank you. Okay, so Beatrice Cenci, so these are two literary pictures. Iago, I don't need to say, is inscribed in Shakespeare. Beatrice Cenci, every single British traveler goes to Italy, talks about Beatrice Cenci, is again that double side of attraction, beauty, and fear, of victim and murder. She killed her father in the story, and then she was killed. So there is and she's performing almost like this peasant, right? So what is happening here? Cameron is the great artist, and yet she's thinking something. And in the book, we try to say somewhat connected to these ideas of the pre-modern, of the peasant, of the popular culture, of the representation of all these figures. And this becomes the villain. George Watts also talks about the attraction to Iago's skin, the skin of the farm, that is like the skin of the farmer's dark skin. There are a lot of othering elements here, which become art because Cameron is photographing them.
This is rather an abrupt ending, but I realize we're almost out of time and we haven't taken any questions. So I think we'll have just a few minutes, but we'd love to take some questions from the audience if you have any.
Oh, okay. So I think the big question here is whose idea is it that we're talking about? Obviously, we're talking about the British idea, and yet there were many Italian photographers, and there were many people who were sort of representing Italy through the camera and through the photograph. There's a very brief essay in the book, which is by Jean-Philippe Garrigue, who works at the Bibliothèque Nationale and has studied John Henry Parker more than anybody else, and has come out with an amazing amount of information about the photographers that Parker employed to take pictures. And in that, he shows that many of the pictures that Parker publishes in his publication, which is a 22-volume publication, and there's no question but that Parker came with an idea of Italy, which was that he wanted to represent early ancient Roman architecture. But he employed this squadron of photographers who themselves had a point of view, and that point of view comes out in these pictures over and over again. And what happened to Parker was he was sort of seduced by these Roman photographers whose purpose was to not just show a Roman ruin, but to show it in the context of the living city. And I think that dialogue it really comes to the essence of whose idea this is.
Yeah,
And I think that although, you know, the idea comes through in the book as the idea of the British going to Rome, but the reality is for centuries they were blown away by Italy, and they were they although they were technically way advanced, they realized that they weren't really advanced from the point of view of the history of architecture and art. So that, I think, is
yeah, Bruce,
something.
I would say that's exactly right, and I hope that actually comes through in the book. That this is not about a kind of idea that is imposed on Italy by the British, although that's part of it, but that it's this dialogue. You know, I don't know if anybody else.
Well, yeah, I was sort of in response to what Bruce is saying, I would say that even though we've scarcely mentioned the importance of the, you know, art, architecture, literature of ancient Rome and of Renaissance Italy, and the aristocratic tradition of the Grand Tour, and the famous Romantic poets who lived and loved and died in Rome, in establishing Italy as the principal destination for the Brits, as opposed to, say, Greece or Spain, which were problematic, or France, problematic with political ramifications. But that the idea of Italy is also a relief from Britain, and that the conditions of Britain. And in the beginning of the century, there were 1 million people in the city. In the middle of the century, there were 3 million people in the city. In 1900, there were 6.5 million people in the city. It was the largest city the world had known at the time. And it was, I made just a quick sort of capture of some of the phrases that described what was going on there. The interminable crowds, the black polluted Thames, the ceaseless din of traffic, the carpet of mud and muck, the canopy of smoke and soot, and a dismal fog that lasted from autumn through spring. As Dickens said, you know, it's the death of the sun. But so you have this mercantile and mechanical mastery that places England, you know, at the top of technological power and prowess, and the Industrial Revolution that's creating this, you know, foul living and working conditions. And so that these sort of geocultural generalizations arise. And, you know, in contrast to, you know, Mediterranean clarity and warmth and sensuality, you have this dark neo-Gothic gloom of Britain with its repressive and sort of sober respectability. So you could even say that the psychological and climatic limitations of life on that modern island nation and in the world's largest city induced this sort of beguiling zone of imaginary escape. And, you know, I think that the idea of Italy is a portmanteau, you know, sort of a word and concept. And so to me, it's a perfect title for this very interesting, dense, informative, and fascinating book. I mean, I think it's so capacious, you know, covers everything.
Thank you, Maria.
If
That might be a
just
good
add
point
really,
to end with, but do we have another question?
I was just going to add very quickly to Bruce's point that I shouldn't go without mentioning that, you know, in terms of whose idea was it, that Ellis, you know, before he made photographs, he actually purchased or commissioned Italian daguerreotypists that are part of that collection. And Ruskin as well, you know, purchased daguerreotypes from a French practitioner of Venice. So those are definitely things to keep in mind when we're talking about, you know, who was the progenitor of that idea to begin with.
Whose Italy is it?
Yeah, yeah. And it's still alluring, right? The idea of Italy is still your country is still, I want to come tomorrow, you know? We all
Well,
do.
I'm not sure.
Oh yeah, well, there's the political situation, yeah.
But yes, no, good point about Alice in Parker, yes.
Thank you for a very, very interesting talk. Just a couple of observations. Chinese visitors to Scotland go there to escape the awful environmental conditions in China because they find, believe it or not, the Scottish atmosphere to be wonderfully attractive to them. I would just like your view on the revolution that's taking place since the period covered by your book, in the vast number of people who are using iPhones as they travel in Italy and elsewhere, have built up a huge, huge library of some of them, I imagine, beautiful photographs. So the ability and facility of taking photographs, where is that going to take us, do you think? But thank you for what you've said.
It's a good question.
Ask Martin Parr.
Recently, I saw a photograph that was a compilation of photographs of about the size of this screen, huge, you know, a whole wall of pictures. And it was, they were all taken, you know, with these cameras that we all have. And they were by a woman named Penelope Umbrico. She's an American, got a good Italian name. And they were all pictures of selfies taken in front of the sunset. And we're not talking about monuments here, but what was interesting is that none of the faces were visible because the glare of the sunset, sort of like the Kit Talbot of the garden at the Villa Reale in Naples, you know, the camera couldn't capture both, you know, the detail of the face and the background. So there's a lot of photographs out there. You're absolutely right. And there are a lot of them that are terrible. But you can now take pictures that are as good or better than an 8x10 professional photograph with these little cameras. So, you know, you can collect it on your phone. You know, you can be a British traveler and you don't have to come back with these big albums that costed you a fortune. It's amazing what can be done now. It's an interesting question.
But this is the genesis. This is the
this is where it starts.
This project is sort of where it starts.
Yeah.
But yes, it's a question one asks every day, especially to young students. Yes, of course, it's global. You don't even need to go there. This is the genesis, right, of constantly still going in front of Leaning Tower and when you take that picture. On the other hand, I think at least my attraction, my interest in this project, engagement in this project, maybe Traces of India, is that there's always this very interesting question about culture and identity. And so beside the global tourism, the camera can indeed be that conduit to understand what someone is seeking in a context that is known, but perhaps there's something new to discover. So I think that's to say that this project is a genesis of certainly photography and the global iPhone that we live in. But also I would like to think that can help us to think about this question of culture and identity and what does the camera do.
Okay. Well, I thank you all for coming this afternoon, or for those of you who are joining us online, for joining us online. Thank you very much.
And to people who are listening.